21 days. That's how long it took for Ethan Cole, an 11-year-old 5th-grade student in Draper, Utah, to go from a completely healthy boy who had played basketball on Saturday, who had fought with his younger sister over the TV remote on Sunday, who had gone to bed on Monday complaining about homework, to a state of irreversible coma with massive documented destruction of brain tissue. 21 days. The length of a school term. The length of a credit card billing cycle. The time it takes you to realize you forgot to call someone important. And what started this process was a glass of water from the kitchen tap at home. Its name is Naegleria fowleri, and it doesn't wait. It doesn't incubate slowly. It doesn't build colonies over weeks like a conventional bacterium. It enters through the nostrils. Not the stomach, not the throat, not the lungs. Through the nostrils. It crosses the olfactory epithelium, perforates the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone with proteolytic enzymes that dissolve connective tissue in a matter of hours, penetrates the olfactory bulb, the most anterior and most exposed brain structure in the human central nervous system, and begins to eat living neural tissue. This is not a metaphor. The mechanism has a clinical name, actin-mediated active phagocytosis, and the mortality rate documented by the CDC for Naegleria fowleri infection in humans is 97.7%. Of every 100 people infected, fewer than 3 survive. What the CDC data reveals about exactly where this amoeba has been found in American water systems will change how you look at your kitchen faucet. But the mechanism by which it gets there, and why standard household filters don't remove it, is the detail that no public health agency clearly communicates. On the night of the 14th day, Ethan's mother, Sandra Cole, 42, a registered nurse with 18 years of experience in pediatrics, took her son to the emergency room at Utah Valley Hospital with a fever of 39.8 degrees Celsius, neck stiffness, severe photophobia, and an episode of projectile vomiting in the car. The attending physician, a third-year resident, looked at the picture and made the decision most doctors make when faced with that set of symptoms. Bacterial meningitis. Broad-spectrum antibiotics. Lumbar puncture for confirmation. Sandra, sitting in the chair next to her son, said something the resident couldn't answer. Did he swim in stagnant water? No, but he drank straight from the garden tap 2 days before it all started. The resident took note. He didn't act on that information. There was a second hypothesis available at that moment. A hypothesis that would completely change the treatment protocol, the medication, the window of survival. The resident didn't consider it. And Ethan had, at that exact moment, approximately 72 hours before irreversible neurological damage. Naegleria fowleri is a free-living protozoan, meaning it doesn't need a host to survive, reproduce, or thrive. It exists in sediments of rivers, lakes, reservoirs, and moist soil throughout the United States, with particularly high documented concentrations in southern states, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Arizona. But the expansion documented by the CDC between 2010 and 2023 shows something that previous epidemiological maps did not predict. The amoeba is moving north. In 2023, cases were confirmed in Nebraska and Iowa, states where the presence of N. fowleri was considered unlikely until 5 years earlier. The reason is a variable that any American knows by name but rarely processes in its biological implications. Increased average water temperature. Naegleria fowleri actively proliferates at temperatures between 25 degrees Celsius and 42 degrees Celsius. As average temperatures in American rivers and reservoirs rise, the geographic window for amoeba proliferation expands along with it. But the contamination route that struck Ethan Cole wasn't a lake, it wasn't a river, it was the household plumbing system. In 2013, the CDC confirmed the first documented case of primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, the clinical name for what N. fowleri does to the brain, transmitted through household tap water in the United States. The victim was a 4-year-old boy in Mississippi who had used tap water to rinse his nostrils during a nasal hygiene ritual. The plumbing had been inspected. Chlorine levels were within the parameters established by the EPA. No regulatory violations were found. The problem is that chlorine at residual concentrations, the concentrations considered safe for human consumption, does not kill Naegleria fowleri in low-flow plumbing systems, where water stagnates in secondary pipes for extended periods, and the internal temperature of the piping rises above 25 degrees Celsius in summer. The amoeba forms cysts, thick-walled, encapsulated structures that resist standard chemical disinfection and waits. When the flow returns, The cysts open, and the active trophozoites, the predatory form of the organism, are ready. The EPA knows this. The disinfection protocol has not been changed. To understand why the mortality rate from Naegleria fowleri is 97.7%, it is necessary to understand what it does to neural tissue, not in general terms, but sequentially hour by hour, with the precision that autopsy reports document. After penetrating the olfactory bulb, N. fowleri trophozoites secrete a protein called NFA1, a molecule that perforates the plasma membrane of neurons, creating pores that cause cell death by osmotic lysis. At the same time, the amoeba secretes phospholipases, enzymes that degrade the myelin sheath, the protective structure of neural axons, and neuraminases, which destroy the glycoprotein connections between brain cells. In human terms, the amoeba doesn't just kill neurons, it dismantles the architecture. It removes the structure that keeps cells connected to each other and digests the resulting tissue as a source of nutrition. The rate of this destruction, documented in biopsies and autopsies of American cases between 1962 and 2023, is as follows. In the first 2 to 4 days after nasal entry, the infection is asymptomatic or presents symptoms interpreted as a common cold, congestion, mild headache. Between the 5th and 7th day, high fever, stiff neck, photophobia, nausea, the picture that leads families to the emergency room, and that doctors, correctly in the statistical context, treat as bacterial meningitis. Between the 8th and 12th day, mental confusion, hallucinations, loss of balance, seizures. Between the 12th and 15th day, coma. Between the 15th and 21st day, death by brain herniation. The progressive swelling of the infected brain tissue pushes the brainstem out of the skull through the foramen magnum. Ethan Cole arrived at the emergency room on the 14th day. The therapeutic window, the period during which the antifungal drug miltefosine, approved by the CDC as an experimental treatment in 2013, has some chance of suppressing the infection, is approximately 7 to 10 days from the onset of symptoms. After that, the accumulated damage to neural tissue is too extensive for survival with significant neurological function to be documented in the medical literature. The resident who treated Ethan did not order the correct diagnostic test, because the correct diagnostic test, PCR analysis of cerebrospinal fluid for N. fowleri, is not in the standard order of tests for meningitis. It is a test that needs to be explicitly ordered by a physician who has actively considered the hypothesis. And actively considering the hypothesis requires that the physician know that the amoeba may be in household tap water, which requires that the CDC communicate this clearly and routinely to healthcare professionals, which does not happen. In 2020, an internal EPA report obtained via the Freedom of Information Act by the ProPublica newspaper documented that agency agents were aware of positive samples for Naegleria fowleri in treated water distribution systems in at least 6 U.S. states between 2015 and 2019. The report recommended reviewing maximum permitted temperature protocols in plumbing systems and expanding minimum residual chlorine limits in low-flow systems. None of the recommendations have been implemented as federal regulation as of the date of this roadmap. The justification recorded in internal documents. Implementation cost incompatible with the budget available for municipal water infrastructure and lack of sufficient case volume to constitute a public health emergency according to the agency's quantitative criteria. The EPA's quantitative criterion for configuring a public health water emergency is by definition a number of deaths, not a risk. Confirmed, documented, attributed deaths, which means that the American protection system works this way. You need to die first, in sufficient numbers, for the water that killed you to be considered a problem that deserves urgent solution. Ethan Cole died on the 21st day. He was the 13th documented case of primary amoebic meningoencephalitis in the United States in 2023, the year with the highest number of cases recorded since the CDC began monitoring the disease in 1962. 13 cases, 13 deaths. Mortality rate, 100% that year. The EPA did not issue a public alert. Since 1962, the CDC has recorded 157 cases of primary amoebic meningoencephalitis caused by Naegleria fowleri in the United States. Of these, 4 people survived. 4 in more than 60 years of records. The first documented survivor was a 9-year-old Californian girl in 1978, whose case remains partially unexplained. The doctors who treated her did not know the diagnosis until weeks after her spontaneous recovery, and the prevailing hypothesis in the literature is that she developed an atypical immune response of, as yet unidentified origin. The three most recent cases, 2013, and 2023, survived because emergency physicians identified the possibility of N. fowleri within the first 48 hours of symptoms, ordered specific PCR of cerebrospinal fluid, contacted the CDC directly for access to the miltefosine stockpile, which is not available in pharmacies, does not have formal FDA approval for this indication, and needs to be released on a case-by-case basis by the agency, and initiated the experimental protocol at controlled body temperature, combined with dexamethasone to reduce intracranial inflammation. All three survived, with permanent neurological deficits ranging from moderate to severe. The 2023 survivor, a 14-year-old from Nebraska, presents 2 years after the infection, with refractory focal epilepsy, working memory difficulties, and below-average language processing for his age group. He survived, but the version of him that existed before the water never returned. Sandra Cole did what any mother would do. When Ethan started having a fever on the 8th day, she medicated him with ibuprofen, the same decision any pediatrician would recommend for an initial viral or bacterial fever. The ibuprofen reduced the fever. Ethan felt temporarily better on the 9th day. Sandra waited another 48 hours before taking him to the hospital because his condition had apparently stabilized. Those 48 hours were the interval in which miltefosine could still have crossed the blood-brain barrier at a therapeutic concentration sufficient to suppress the infection with a real chance of significant neurological preservation. Ibuprofen did not cause the infection. It did not accelerate the Naegleria fowleri, but it masked the sign that would have led Sandra to the emergency room 2 days earlier. The instinct to alleviate her son's suffering created the illusion of improvement that consumed the window of survival. The right drug existed. The correct diagnosis was attainable. The window was open, and the maternal instinct not to take a child to the hospital while he seems to be improving closed that window forever. There was no negligence. There was no bad faith. There was a mother doing exactly what all her experience and all her love indicated was right. And it was enough that it was too late. What the American water protection system learned from Ethan Cole, from the other 12 deaths of 2023, and from the 157 documented cases over more than 6 decades is this. Naegleria fowleri in treated water systems is a measurable, documented risk, with a known transmission mechanism, an identified treatment window, and an available experimental survival protocol. What Ethan never received was a timely diagnosis, because no doctor at Utah Valley Hospital in November 2023 had been trained to consider Naegleria fowleri as a differential diagnosis in a child with acute meningeal syndrome with no history of exposure to open recreational water. Because tap water is not open recreational water, it's kitchen water. It's water that every American assumes is safe because they pay taxes, because there's a federal agency called the EPA, and because no one who drinks tap water imagines they're betting 97.7% against themselves. The EPA didn't change the protocol. Doctors didn't receive the training. Miltefosine remains unavailable in pharmacies. And the tap keeps running. The agency named the risk and turned on the tap. The difference between exposure to Naegleria fowleri that does not result in infection and one that destroys a child's central nervous system in 3 weeks is not genetic luck or access to cutting-edge medical technology. It's the route of entry. Naegleria fowleri only causes primary meningoencephalitis when it enters through the nostrils under pressure, meaning that oral exposure to contaminated water by itself does not produce infection. The organism does not survive gastric acid. The risk is not drinking the water. The risk is aspirating it, inhaling it, or using it in nasal hygiene procedures. First, never use unboiled tap water in nasal irrigation devices such as neti pots or nasal spray bottles. Use only distilled water, boiled and cooled water, or sterile saline solution from a sealed container. This single behavior eliminates the most frequent route of transmission in domestic environments. Second, during periods of intense heat, when the ambient temperature consistently exceeds 32 degrees Celsius for several consecutive days, the internal temperature of low-flow pipes in American homes, especially outdoor and garden pipes, can reach the active proliferation range of the amoeba. Purge out standing water before using any garden tap or hose that has been unused for more than 48 hours on hot days. Third, and most importantly, if a child presents with a high fever with neck stiffness and any history of exposure to water, any water, including tap water, in the previous 2 weeks, explicitly demand that the doctor consider primary amoebic meningoencephalitis and request that they contact the CDC for the emergency protocol with miltefosine. Don't expect the doctor to remember on their own. They probably won't, because the system hasn't prepared them for it. Ethan Cole went to the hospital at the right time, with the right symptoms, with a mother who was a registered nurse, and who provided the correct information. And it wasn't enough, because no one in the emergency room knew what to do with that information. Now you know. And if one day you're in that waiting room, you'll be the difference between an open window and a closed window. But Naegleria fowleri isn't the only organism that American water systems are failing to eliminate. In the next video, the bacterium that the EPA knows exists in 68% of older plumbing systems in the United States, which produces a neurotoxin capable of reducing the IQ of children chronically exposed to doses considered safe by current federal standards. You already know the name. What it does inside, nobody really told you.